Yalta and Potsdam. In 1945, the big three leaders met in Yalta in the Ukraine, just on the Black Sea coast over here, to decide the future of Europe. On the agenda was what to do with Germany, what to do with the newly liberated countries of Eastern Europe, how to rebuild Western Europe, and also how to resolve the conflict in the Far East. The leaders at the Yalta Conference were Joseph Stalin, Franklin Roosevelt of the United States, and Winston Churchill of Great Britain. Churchill and Roosevelt had agreed to some basic principles about the rebuilding of Europe and also world affairs after World War II in the Atlantic Charter shortly before the agreement. Stalin broadly agreed with these ideas, but disagreed over some of the details. At Yalta, the big three leaders got on relatively well, as still it was in their best interest to cooperate. World War II was still going on. The Red Army and the Americans and British troops in the West were still cooperating, and the Americans, British and Soviets were still fighting the Japanese in the East. At Yalta, therefore, agreement was relatively easy. Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed to establish the United Nations. They agreed on the division of Germany into 4 zones and also Berlin into the same 4 zones. They agreed on the division of Austria into 2 zones to be administered by the Soviet Union and by the Americans. They also agreed in the Far East that the Russians would support the Americans in fighting against the Japanese, and Korea would be divided into 2 zones, with the Americans administering the south and the Russians administering the north. Eastern Europe caused more problems and was more difficult to reach agreement on. However, the big three agreed on the basic principles of free elections in Eastern Europe, and they also agreed to change the borders of Poland to allow Joseph Stalin to have more territory for the Soviet Union. This issue of Poland, though, was to remain a problem going forward into the next conference at Potsdam, as Stalin wanted to make sure that his communist-friendly government in Poland remained in control, whereas Winston Churchill was very keen to allow the anti-communist London Poles to take their place in the Polish government. However, the Yalta Conference was broadly a success, but some of the issues like Poland, the division of Germany, and the agreements about the Far East were to come back to cause problems later in the Cold War. Shortly after the Yalta Conference, and after the end of World War II, the big three leaders met again, this time in July 1945 in Potsdam. Much had changed, however, in the few months in between the two conferences, as you can see from this picture. Winston Churchill had been replaced by Clement Attlee and was in fact replaced during the conference. Joseph Stalin remained in power. Roosevelt had been replaced after his death by Harry Truman. Harry Truman was much more aggressive and less prepared to work with the Soviets, partly because of his own ideologies and lack of preparedness for Cold War international relations, and also because by now the Second World War had all but ended, and so the Soviets and the Americans no longer needed to cooperate. Furthermore, Stalin seemed to have gone back on his word about free elections in Eastern Europe and Poland, and at the same time Truman also knew he had one trump card that he was just about to play in the Cold War and in international relations more generally. Truman knew that he was shortly to drop the atomic bomb, end the war in the Far East, and also begin the Cold War with the Americans very much in the ascendancy. Stalin was terrified of this nuclear technology and was trying very hard through a combination of spying and the Soviet Union's own nuclear research to develop a Russian atomic bomb. When the atomic bomb was dropped just 3 days after the Potsdam Conference, the Cold War was very much alive. The major issues, as we just discussed, that remained at the Potsdam Conference were what to do with Poland, and really no satisfactory agreement was reached. The similar can be said about Eastern Europe, where Soviet troops had effectively begun to set up satellite or puppet states in all of the countries of Eastern Europe, with the exception really of Czechoslovakia and East Germany, which were to join this communist hegemony as the Cold War progressed. Both these conferences, Potsdam and Yalta, very much set the tone for the Cold War, as they showed the lack of trust between the leaders, their inability to make key agreements, and the desires particularly of the Soviets and the Americans very much to promote their own interests in negotiation with the other. Now have a go at these questions here and see how you get on now you've listened to the video.